All right, so we are in chapter 4. We've gone through, we've been going through different religious traditions to trying to understand different worldviews that are out there. And worldviews are important. Why? Because worldviews affect our communication. They affect how we understand the world, and how we understand the world determines how we conduct ourselves, how we communicate with everybody in the world. And so essentially, what I'd like to do is, I'd like to continue going through the chapter and reflect on other religious traditions that we haven't covered yet. Remember, the book selects some of the major religious traditions that it wants to highlight. Why those are not the others? Because those are the most influential and the most numeric. There's various reasons why. Most of the people that you will encounter in life will fall into one of those religious traditions that we're looking at. Now, there will be people who will not fall into neither, and that's okay. But we will focus to cover the basis, sort of say, of what can be covered in a short time. Let's put it that way. So, how much can we really learn about somebody in a short period of time? Well, very little. Well, in the time that we do have, we'd like to be able to do that. All right, so we have talked about Christianity, and we've talked about Judaism as religious traditions and what that means for people essentially creating a worldview for themselves and how that orients them to communicate with everyone else in the world. Okay, so today we're going to continue into Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and Confucianism. Okay, so these are a little bit different. So Islam, to me personally, it falls along the line of Christianity and Judaism. It's not that radically different. I think it flows within the same conceptual world. Let's put it this way: it has more similarities than differences, I think. So let's begin with Islam. That's on page 129. Okay. The authors express an idea that in this section is that most non-Muslims do not understand Islamic faith, and they're right. A lot of, I would say, especially Westerners, do not understand Islamic faith because it's so different from them. In the end, it's not even Islam; it's the fundamental difference between East and the West that confuses the people. Okay. Eastern thinking versus Western thinking. In fact, I think Asians, for example, understand Islam a lot better than Westerners, than Europeans. Okay, why? Because their Eastern thinking intuitively allows them to, kind of clue into some of these ideas. And there's also a lot of animosity towards Islam in this world, and that's why actually I noticed. I don't know if you noticed or not, but the authors of this particular textbook are being extremely defensive and apologetic of Islam. They defend Islam more than any other religion. Why? Well, because there's a lot of abuse. People say harsh things about Islam, mostly, of course, people non-Muslims, because they don't understand it, and they say all kinds of things that are not true, and that it mischaracterizes a lot of Muslims, and it's difficult. So they kind of stick up for them and try to defend them a little bit more than everybody else. Okay. So just be aware of that. One of the reasons is that, the tradition is so misunderstood, is that, again, it's just different. And the recent world events with, Islam being in the focus in all the different religious wars and stuff like that, it creates this idea that basically, it's a militant religion. It's all about war. It's all about terrorism and things like that. So I don't know if you remember this or not, but earlier in the textbook, the authors noted that, talked about, Islam and Arabs and Muslims, and it's not all the same thing. There's plenty of people who follow Islam who are not Arabs, and there's many Arabs who do not follow Islam. Let's put it that way. So we tend to characterize people by just assigning these categories to them and just saying, okay, well, this is what he looks like, therefore this is what he is, and that's what he believes, and that's how he lives his life. So Muslim means an Arab, and that means a terrorist. That's it. Kind of like very simplistic way, very unfair, but that is how a lot of people look at it, because they have no familiarity with Muslims, period, or Islam as a religion, or that the terrorism is basically one particular, let's say, stream within Islam. Okay. And it is realistic. We can't just say, oh, the terrorists are not Muslims. No, they are Muslim, and they are driven by Muslim ideology. But it's only one small segment of Islamic thought that drives people to this type of a behavior, where there's many other Muslims who would never even think of doing such a thing as going and, killing people, exploding stuff just because to prove their point that their religion is the greatest or something like that. That's the idea. So there's a lot of condemnations of Islamic faith. There's a lot of condemnations of Islam. There's a lot of misunderstanding, partially because of the terrorism that's been going on, and especially in the Western population, especially in U.S., since September 11th in 2001, when the huge terrorist act had taken place in New York, taking down entire buildings full of people. That caused, a tragedy for American people that is still very much felt today. In fact, we have just celebrated September 11th a few days ago, and people were actually memorializing that day still, 10 years later. Okay. It's a big deal. But that is a bad thing for Islam. Why? Because those men who did that identified themselves as Muslims and identified their cause as Islam, and therefore gave a bad name to everyone. I just want to remind people that sometimes people do things in the name of religion that's not entirely right or true, and actually completely wrong. There are people who, for example, the slaughtered Jews during the Holocaust, who identified themselves as Christians, and they believed that they were doing a Christian thing. In fact, they even quoted Bible verses to justify what they were doing. Okay, that doesn't make the murder of innocent people right, and it certainly gives Christians a bad name. And I certainly know that Christians would not be happy to say that, hey, I'm proud to be a Christian because of what these people did. So please understand that this is how a lot of Muslims feel about terrorists as well. So, but Islam is a very large religion, very diverse, and about 23% of the world's population, okay, is basically following this worldview. The Islamic worldview is embraced by about 23%. That's huge. That's actually huge. This is why anybody should study, religions should study Islam, because of how big the influence of Islam is. And the same thing in the United States as well. United States, Islam is probably going to become one of the major religions fairly soon, and it might even become a dominant religion with time, because Christianity is kind of sort of, say, the traditional religion of the United States, but I think it's fading away little by little, at least in numbers. And so I see that all the time. So the origins of Islam, it's always important to understand how religions came to be. And so a lot of times, if you want to understand religion, you have to know its history. Like, how did it really come to be? How did it develop? And so the story that the authors tell is a fairly standard story. Islam is a religion that's essentially younger than Christianity, younger than Judaism. Muhammad lives in the 5th century, and Muhammad is the man who receives revelation from angel. And those revelations, those teachings, those things that he was taught by the angel, he then later communicates to his followers, and that becomes the basis of the holy book we know as Quran. So Quran is the holy book that was basically given or dictated or related through special revelation to Muhammad from the angel. Okay. And so he started to take those messages from the angels and to teach them to his followers, and thus the religion of Islam was formed. Now, Muhammad himself was not a monotheist. He actually came as an Arab. He was a polytheist. Polytheistic society is where he comes from, where people worship small tribal gods, tribal deities, okay? And so for him, the revelation of one God was a big deal, which is one of the central core beliefs of Islam, is the belief in one God. Of course, this is kind of silly to us because we think about it, by then Christianity is already, believing in one God, and Judaism has been believing in one God for a long, long time. And all of a sudden, these, tribal Arab people discover this idea that there's one God. Although they don't discover it by embracing Christianity, they don't discover it by embracing Judaism. They discover it through their own unique way by having a prophet, by having Muhammad to be the receiver of these messages. And so his message is not that different from Christianity and Judaism. In fact, if you were to analyze the Quran, there's a lot of overlap with both. But people would argue about that. So, but because it comes after Christianity and Judaism, it is not hard for a scientific person to realize that the Islam is being influenced by those religious movements. Although the textbook doesn't talk about it, timing is important. So what we know and when we know it makes a big difference. So that knowledge was certainly accessible to Muhammad, and he wasn't a stranger to the talk of Christians and Jews before he encountered Angel in that cave while he was meditating. All right, so that's a little bit on the history of Islam. Basically, we're talking about 6th century is when it comes to be. And that will be 6th century of our era, common era, okay? And so what are the core assumptions of Islam? Well, one of the core beliefs is there's only one God. Remember, for Arabs who were polytheistic, proclaiming one God was a big deal. And so it's an absolute monotheism. Sometimes Muslims are a little bit critical of Christians. They don't consider Christians to be true monotheists. Sometimes they criticize them because they believe in Trinity and Virgin Mary and all this other kind of stuff. And so sometimes Muslims are somewhat critical of Christians. They don't have as much problem with Jews because Jews have a very strict monotheism, but they think that Christians are a little bit too loose with their ideology. But anyway, so they do believe in one God, one, absolutely one, and there's no other. Okay. And there's no rival gods. There's no multiple gods. There's just one. Everything else is a non-God. Let's put it that way. All right. So that's a very strict, very narrow definition of monotheism. Now, another core important feature of Islam is the belief in Quran. Quran is their scripture. It is a sacred text which was recorded by the followers of Muhammad. Muhammad, as far as I remember, Muhammad was not even literate. He wasn't an educated man, so he didn't even write down the words that the angel gave him. I think it is his followers who wrote them down. And so essentially, Quran is the holy book. It means recitation. And it is the basic and the core authority for Muslims, just like the Bible would be for Jews and Christians. Quran is considered to be the words of God, literal words directly from him. So it's very important to study them for Muslims. Quran contains very little narratives. There's few stories in Quran, but mostly it's not stories. Mostly it's teachings and commandments. They have to do more with the way of life and philosophy and proper actions, and a little bit less with storytelling. So if you're familiar with the Bible, there's a lot of storytelling. Whether you read the New Testament or the Old Testament, there's a lot of stories there being told. Events being related. Quran is not like that. Less stories, more commandments. Let's put it that way. Okay, more teachings that are ethical and moral and not as much storytelling. Now, important concept to understand also in Islam is the concept of submission. Okay, that's what Islam means. Islam actually means submission. And what is submission to? Submission is to God. The core idea is that if God is one, and he's merciful and good and all these things, then you must submit to him and to his will. And that's what Islam is. Islam is a system that teaches you how to submit to God and to live in accordance with His will, His directives, His desires, His commandments, things like that. So it's not really about you; it's about submitting to God, and that's what Islam essentially is. And so Muslims, of course, believe that only within this attitude of submission can one find true inner peace and contention. So. All right. Now, one of the really important beliefs for Muslims is the belief in predestination. I know a lot of Christians embrace predestination. What is predestination? Basically, predestination means that God decides the future. There's this idea of fate, that things are sealed. Whatever God decided, whatever He basically said will happen, and it will happen exactly the way He will happen, and there's nothing you or I or anybody else can do to change that, basically. This is the idea of fate among societies that are not deistic. Fate, this was supposed to happen, this is my destiny, this is my fate. Or in a society that is more theistic, like Muslim society, where basically Allah is the one who decides what's going to happen to you, how it's going to happen. And it could be big things or it could be little things. But that's the idea of a predestination. You are not really in charge of guiding your life. God is. And that's the idea. Now, for some Christians, that is a familiar concept. There's a segment of Christianity that very heavily believes that everything has been predestined. Everything has been forewritten, and you don't even put on the right color of shirt by yourself this morning. Kind of God guided you in that direction. There are some people who believe that. Well, there's another branch of Christianity that believes the opposite, that you have all the choice. That yes, maybe some big things were predestined, but you can decide and you can change your future. And depending on what you do in life, your life is going to work out one way or another. But your choices essentially end up guiding you towards good things or bad things. And so there's different philosophies and different theological ideas about predestination. But Quran leans on the humans not really having much of control in as far as their personal choices go, to do things or not to do things. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay. Another important aspect of Islam that needs to be mentioned is judgment. Muslims, like Christians and like Jews, believe that people should live ethical lives and they're answerable to God for being, moral and just, and there are certain things that people are commanded to do and they must obey. And so in the end of life, when the life ends, when a person dies, they stand before God and they're judged. They're judged based on how they lived, based on whether they were good followers of those commandments or bad followers of those commandments of how they received. So essentially, both Christians, Jews, and Muslims all believe in this idea of the final judgment, that people stand in front of God and have to account. And they also all believe into existence of heaven and hell. So the good place and the bad place that people are assigned to depending on whether they were obedient or disobedient. How well they did determines, where they end up. So there's this in some cultures, and this is certainly true of all three religions, there's this notion of God judging their good deeds and their bad deeds as if putting them on the scales or something like that, and whichever one outweighs is the one that where you end up. So almost judgment is a pretty big deal in Islamic thought. A lot of the daily life is basically guided by this notion of I am being judged later in my life for how I act now, how I behave today. So you could see how that forms a spiritual life of a person in a major way, believing in an afterlife and believing in judgment and paradise and hell and things like that. actually makes a huge influence on a person's daily life. All right, so those are kind of the core assumptions. Do you guys want to raise something? You have any questions? Something you want to throw out at me? You know, I'm not an expert in Islam, but I have studied Islam for quite a while, so maybe I can answer your question. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you straightforward. I don't. Okay, but I have studied Islam for years. So if you have a question about any kind of major beliefs or ideas, you know, feel free, jump in. I'll throw it out.
Sir, I have question about the origin of Islam. In the book, they said Muhammad started this religion,
Yes.
but I have not started. I haven't studied about Islam, but I heard here and there, Islam started by, not started by, they are the Islam people. They are the descendants of the first son of Abraham, Ismail.
Yeah.
So is it related to between Islamic people and Ismail?
Well, this is a great question. So let me answer it in couple of steps for you, Paul. Basically, the Arab people claim to be descendants of Ishmael from the Bible. So if you're familiar with the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham had another son, Ismael, right? And so Ishmael is his son from an Egyptian handmaiden, not from Sarah. Okay, he had wife Sarah, and then he had an Egyptian handmaiden. So that's how the Bible tells the story. And of course, he is the firstborn of Abraham, but he's not firstborn from his wife. He's a firstborn from a servant. Okay, so technically, he's not an heir, let's say, to Abraham because he's from an illegal wife. You know, let's put it that way. I don't know if you understand the institution of marriage and how it worked back then, but that's how it works. So that's the story that the Torah tells. And of course, that's the story that the Christians know because Christians use the same exact scriptures that Jews do. Okay, now in Quran, the story is a little bit different. Okay, in Quran, Ismail is the true son of Abraham, and Isaac is the kind of the side son. He's the illegitimate son or something like that. So it actually takes a completely different approach. Okay, but keep in mind that while the story in the Torah, you know, is ancient, let's say, by thousands of years more than Abraham, than Muhammad and his own story. So which story you're going to believe is really up to you. But it is the same essential story. So the Arabs claim their descent from Ishmael, and they are right in that sense, because if you believe the Torah, it's going to tell you that the Ishmaelites settled in this particular area and lived this particular area. If you read the biblical information, it actually matches where they lived. So yeah, it is their descent. As a people, as an ethnos, as a people group, they are descended. It doesn't mean that they have maintained the religion of Abraham, okay? Because everything that Abraham believed and continued to believe, Abraham was not a polytheist. Abraham was the first monotheist. But if you read the stories of Ishmaelites and how they have continued on as a people, how did they turn to be polytheists? You know, if Abraham, their forefather, was a monotheist, they certainly did not follow the way. Let's put it this way, because then there would be no need for Muhammad to say there's one God. Because if they already believed in one God, then there's no point of him teaching that. Yet that was the central and the most important teaching that Muhammad brings to his people, is that there's only one God. Abandon all the others; they're not gods. So yeah, you're right. That is the story. They claim their descent to Abraham, although their religion doesn't really begin with Abraham. It really begins with Muhammad receiving revelation in a cave. You see what I mean? There's a disconnect. There are thousands of years between Abraham and Muhammad. What did they do in between? Is the question, right? Well, obviously, they did not follow the lifestyle of Abraham and his teachings. You know, something else happened in between. And that's why Muhammad comes in and says, get back to your origins, you know, get back to the right path. And let me give you the revelation from angel, okay, Gabriel. And that's the idea. Does that make sense, Paul? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And I have another question
Go
about
ahead. Go ahead.
So in this textbook, they said the Islam is the fastest religion in the world.
Perhaps, yes.
So is there any particular reason why the Islamic religion spread so fast? Because when I was in Korea, I also heard about that. In Korea, we have no Islamic people, not so much, but in several years, there are a lot of people who follow this religion.
Right. I'll,
So,
I'll explain why, and I'll explain it from a perspective of other people who study Islam. The reason why Islam is faster growing than other religions is two-faceted. Number one, missionary activity. Number two, birth rate. Okay? How many children does an average Asian family have? One. That's right. One. Maybe two, right? Do you know how many children does an average Islamic family have? 5 or more. So, if I want more followers of Islam, I simply have more children. That's one way. And the other way is the missionary way. So, not only I turn people who are not Muslims into Muslims, okay, by convincing them of the way, but I'm also giving birth to these children, and then those new converts also giving birth to lots of children. So the explosion is, the growth is arithmetical progression. It's very fast, because it's social cultural dynamic that basically makes it grow fast. It's not that they're better in preaching their message. They're doing two things at the same time. Christians are not doing that. European Christians are in the same exact situation. American Christians, same exact situation. Most families have one or two kids max. That's it. So just the birth rate alone is making Islam one of the fastest growing religions. Now, Asian religions are the same way. Confucianism, Buddhism, they're also fast growing, but they're not fast growing through missionary activity. They're fast growing just because they have massive populations, and the birth rate is still keeping them up, essentially. So that's the difference. I mean, Confucianism or Buddhism doesn't really send out people in every corner of the world to make other people into followers of Buddha or something like that. That is not the way. But by simply having a large population and continuing to grow that population, the religion continues to grow. With other religions, if two Christian people have only one child, they just gone down in half, right? That's two people producing only one. You see how it's easy to shrink if you keep doing that. So unless Christians start having at least two children or more, there will be no growth in that direction, at least naturally. Ideologically, there could still be growth, but naturally won't. So hopefully that explains to you the dynamic of why it is the fastest growing religion. Those are the sort of scientific factors that help us see it. All right. Any other questions about Islam, tenets of Islam, main ideas that are in there? I know it's as the author said, it's a very misunderstood religion. So there's a lot of problems, sort of that people don't understand about Islam. There's a lot of misconceptions. So it's okay to ask questions to clarify these things for you. It's perfectly fine. All right, let's jump into the next section. It's talks about the pillars of Islam. The pillars of Islam are like the main tenets, the main beliefs. Think of it as the kind of the statement of faith or something like that for Christians or something like that, or the confession or catechism, whatever you want to call it. So something like that. The 5 pillars of Islam are like the foundational ideas. So the first one is the statement of belief, okay, shahada, that basically says that there is one God, and there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's it. Every Muslim repeats this 5 times a day. 5 times a day. It is the acknowledgement of the one central tenet of faith. God is one, Muhammad is his prophet. That's it. The other aspect, the other pillar is Salat, means prayer. and that is basically a custom or ritual or an action that every Muslim performs 5 times a day, throughout the day. And there's a recitation. The prayer is formal. It's not like Christians pray in their own words or something like that. It's just a formal prayer. It's the same words every time. And it's done by bowing and facing Mecca, the holy city. So every Muslim performs that, and as long as they perform that, that is their religious duty. That is one of the tenets of being Muslim, is praying 5 times a day, pronouncing the Shahada, and bowing and facing Mecca. The other fundamental tenet of Islam is almsgiving. Okay, zakat, almsgiving, or charity, we can call it. Every Muslim is obligated to give charity. Okay, not an option not to give. There is no such thing as a non-giving Muslim, and so Muslims must contribute to charity. And so it's not like tithe for Christians, by the way. I know Christians talk about tithing and 10% and things like that. Muslims, I think, maybe give 3 to 5%, maybe something like that. I don't remember exactly what their theology says, but it's not like 10% for Christians or anything like that. And it is a moral obligation. It's just something that a Muslim does. The Muslim gives because God gives. Muslim helps others because this reflects the nature of who Allah is. Allah is merciful. Therefore, we need to show mercy to other people by giving something of ourselves. And that's the idea. Fasting is another aspect. Muslims do fast. However, this is not like a Christian fast. It's quite different. Jews fast, Christians fast, but we all fast in our own way. Muslims have a religious month of Ramadan, during which simply they do not eat at the daytime. Only after the sunset you eat. So if you encounter a Muslim during Ramadan and they're a little bit on the edge and kind of unhappy, it's because they're hungry. And they've been going all day as hungry, and they're not going to get to eat until the sun sets. So you'll have a lot of people who are kind of cranky and angry walking around because they're hungry. I don't know if you know this or not, but the human body does have limitations, and we do exhibit our moods based on how we feel. And when you're hungry, you don't always feel good. So it could be very irritable. But Muslims believe that this is a part of their self-discipline. It's spiritual. They don't fast so that they can lose weight. Okay? It's not for health reasons. It is purely spiritual. It's to show self-control. It's to show that, hey, I am not so loose that I don't even can control myself. I should be able to limit myself intentionally. And then the 5th pillar of Islam is Hajj. Hajj is pilgrimage to Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, where people basically go to visit the holy place and participate in a number of religious rituals that reenact the life of Muhammad and things like that. And so essentially Hajj is a religious pilgrimage. It is something that Muslims are directed to do at least once in their life if they can. Some never do. Okay, some never get there. But usually people are directed to go to Mecca at least once in their lifetime and visit that place and participate in the rituals. And so maybe you've seen, pictures or videos of that. It's a pretty amazing thing, but it's a huge pilgrimage. So those are the pillars of Islam. Those are the things that every Muslim must do to be a Muslim. And if they don't do it, they're not a good Muslim. Let's put it that way. Okay. Those are the core ideals. As you could see, everything in that system really has to do with doing and living. Okay. It's not about what you believe. It's what you do that matters. And so you can understand how that translates into people's lives. And therefore it translates into people's actions and their communication as well, which is why we're talking about that. Now, there is a few more discussions over here on the aspects of Islam that people need to understand. The author talks about jihad. jihad and how that word is misunderstood and how lots of people only are familiar with one aspect of jihad. And that's true, and that's actually very fair. At the foundation of any religion that seeks to have a person live a righteous life, a life that is proper, everyone recognizes what we call the struggle. Okay? So that's what jihad means. Jihad means struggle. You struggle against what? You struggle against the internal forces and external forces. The internal forces detract you, take you away from being a good person living the right life. So you're constantly having to make the choices. Do I do this or do I do that? Do I behave this way or do I behave? And that's the struggle. I think Christians understand that struggle. There are commandments that Christians must follow, and people don't always follow them, right? And sometimes they break the rules, so to say, and realize I failed. I didn't do so well. So that's the struggle. Everyone struggles on a personal level. And then there's the bigger struggle, the struggle against the world, the external circumstances. We fight within ourselves to be a good person, but then we fight within outside of ourselves to be a good person, because the exterior forces, the society we live in, affects us negatively, right? And so we have to resist the influences from the outside as well, and that's the external jihad. Now, people have defined jihad as the holy war, and you could see how that conceptually could be true. Think of it. Every Christian fights a holy war against sin and death every single day, right? You're supposed to be a good Christian. You're supposed to live a good life. Well, you're supposed to fight against sin. That's holy war against evil and sin and badness and everything that exists in the world. Muslims are no different, and they express that through the word jihad. And that's where the problem comes in, is that that word has been used by extremists to explain of how a person should fight the external forces, and external forces usually mean non-Muslims, okay, and how you're supposed to fight the non-Muslims to basically create a better world. The more non-Muslims you get rid of, the better, or the more Muslim the world will be, right? That makes sense. And that's so people, what they do is they take that word, holy war or jihad, and they say, all right, we need to fight against the unfaithful, and by basically taking them out of this world, we are creating a better world. All right. So I think Christians can understand that. It's not that different. Christians may not believe in, militant fighting or something like that, although historically they have. But the idea of going and spreading the good news across all the world and making the whole world Christian is not that different than what followers of Islam believe about making the whole world Muslim. The question is how you do it. Some people turn to violence and subversion, to do that. And that historically has been a part of Islam, and it has been a part of Christianity as well. And in some degrees, even a part of Judaism, believe it or not. So many religions have sort of gone in that direction. So that's the concept of jihad. I thought it was pretty well explained. The fact that Islam is a complete way of life, I think it's fairly understood. There is no separation in Islam there's no distinction between religious aspect and non-religious aspect of life. Okay, and this is fundamental, again, to the Eastern thinking, not the Western thinking. In the Western thinking, you can segment your spiritual life from your non-spiritual life. An Eastern thinker thinks in a holistic way and says there is no such thing as non-spiritual life. Everything I do is spiritual. I wake up in the morning, that's spiritual. I take the first breath, is spiritual. I wash my face, that's spiritual. There is nothing that I do that's non-spiritual, because I'm a spiritual being at the core. Now, an Easterner thinks that way, but the Westerner says, this is what I do that is religious and spiritual, and this is what I do that's not religious or not spiritual, and so they segment their lives into spiritual and non-spiritual. That's a very foreign idea for an Easterner, and certainly a foreign idea for a Middle Easterner, which what most Islam comes from the Middle East. So life is seen as holistic. Your religious life is religious. Your political life is religious. Your family life is religious. Your food is religious. Your clothing is religious. Everything you do, your speech is religious. There isn't anything that you do in life that's not religious. And so for Muslims, it's all encompassing, okay? Where for the Westerners, people find ways to separate their religious observances from their mundane secular lives. Let's put it that way. And that's a major difference of perception and understanding. When you walk into a Muslim home, you immediately know that you're in a Muslim home. Immediately, okay? When you meet a Muslim person, you know that you're meeting a Muslim person. Okay, when you walk into a Christian home, you may not realize that you're in a Christian home because they don't look so different from a non-Christian home. Or when you meet a Christian, you don't know that they're Christian unless they tell you or they have some sort of a visual sign that they choose to exhibit. But even that may not even be, entirely true. But so that's the difference. It's like, is it all encompassing or not? Christians, for example, they're not directed by their religious rules to eat a certain way or not to eat a certain way. They're not directed to dress a certain way or not to dress a certain way, or to pray in a uniform fashion 5 times a day. That just doesn't exist in Christianity. So there's so much difference where in Islam, everything is kind of a little bit more uniform, and it's very easy to identify, the lifestyle is more structured, let's put it that way. So Sharia law, that's something that's been a topic in the news a lot. Sharia law is an Islamic law. It's a law that's based on the Quran and the Hadith and the interpretations of the Islamic scholars. Hadith is the oral tradition of Islam. And so basically what it is, it's a biblical law. If you think about it, if we take the Bible and we make that the law of the land, that's what Sharia is. Again, it is a law that touches on every area of life, whether we talk about politics or family relations or food or anything. It has to do with everything. Crimes, anything. Where in the Western society, people separate law from religion. In Islamic society, it's inseparable. Why? Because it's just all encompassing. It's just life. And life is religious. And therefore, it would make sense that a religious instruction or a religious book will give you guidance for every aspect and area of your life. And so people get freaked out because, of course, Islam being an ancient religion, it has a lot of very harsh rules, cutting off the heads and cutting off hands of people and things like that for various things. And so Westerners cringe at that. But, it's an ancient religion. It comes from antiquity. It is what it is. We may think it's barbaric and uncivilized, but, how is that any different than French people, executing people by guillotine by cutting off their heads? No different at all. It's just a few years back, we thought that was okay. And now we think it's not. The truth is that Quran hasn't changed. It says what it says. And the Bible talks about stoning people to death, as well. So whether we choose to accept it or not, those texts do talk about some pretty gruesome punishments. And so when you make the Bible the actual law, that's what Sharia law would be like, essentially. And that's the concept. So it's basically, that's what Sharia law is. The issue of gender is a big deal in Islam, and that's a huge misunderstanding, once again, between the East and the West, and a huge misunderstanding between Western ethics and values and Eastern understanding of women. So in the West, there's a notion of equality between genders. So women supposed to have everything that men supposed to have in every way possible. Okay. Where in the East, and particularly in a Middle Eastern culture, that has never been the case. It's never been seen as even positive. And so as a result, a lot of Western societies look at Islam and they talk about women being subjugated and basically abused for all intents and purposes. And so whether we're talking about women wearing a head covering in Islam, a hijab, or something else, basically we look, the Westerners tend to look at the Islamic way of life as women suffering, as men making it hard for women to live, making them cover their faces, they can't drive, they're not allowed to have great education, they're not allowed to do this, they're not allowed to do that. So there's a lot of limitations on women that men don't have, basically. And so people look at that and they say, now Islam is a religion that subjugates women and things like that. And so when you talk to Muslim women, of course, they will think differently, because they will not see themselves as being subjugated, although they do see gender roles in a very specific way, in a very traditional way, in the way the Quran describes it. And I think in Christianity, something very similar as well. In Christianity, women see themselves as having their own unique, distinct place, and they would not call themselves subjugated or persecuted or oppressed necessarily. A lot of times women would say, this is just the gender roles that the Bible presents us, and it presents as a pattern or paradigm which we function within those roles that God has outlined. And it's not necessarily of being bad or good, it's being different, you know. So whether we talk about equality or inequality, these are complicated conversations, whether we talk of those things within Judaism or Islam or Christianity. The idea is that to be careful about these things, because what we think is equality is not necessarily what other people think equality is. We define those things differently. Some people define equality as sameness, okay? Sameness. Well, there is no such thing as sameness, because not one of us is the same with everyone else. I may be stronger than you, and you may be smarter than me, and Paul may be quicker than all of us. You know, none of us are same, you know, but some people would say equality is sameness. Well, no, it's not, you know, so there is no such thing as the same, and that makes us unequal already. Let's put it that way. If one of us is taller than the other, then we're really not equal anymore, because now I could see the top of your head and you can't see the top of mine. See, we're not equal. So our crazy ideas about what equality is and what it's not sometimes are misguided. And so when we try to apply them to religions or systems we don't understand, they make no sense at all. So while there are differences, major differences in how gender is perceived and equality is perceived in Islam, we simply have to understand them and not necessarily criticize them, because they are what they are. If we understand them, then we simply work within those parameters that we get. Okay, so that's kind of the several major ideas that are covered on Islam. I don't know if any one of you want to jump in or ask a question, anything specific or generic. I'll see if I can help you out here. Anyone? All right, again, just to remind you, the purpose of this is to understand the big picture about people's religious experiences and to be able to draw some conclusions on how they might communicate. You know, for example, if women play a very particular role in Islamic society, and you speak to a woman who is Muslim and you're a man and she doesn't speak back to you, it's not because she's being rude. It's because she's being guided by the rules of ethics of Islam, and she simply will not speak to you because it's inappropriate for her to speak to a man who's not her husband. You see, it's considered unchaste. It is considered wrong to do that. So sometimes you have run into communication encounters which rub you the wrong way, but the person is not doing anything wrong as far as they're concerned. In fact, what they're doing is they're doing right, because that's what their religion, their culture tells them is the right action is. You know, same thing happens with Orthodox Jews. If an Orthodox Jew is sitting on the bus and there's a seat right next to him, and you're a woman and you walk in and you sit down right next to him, I guarantee you he will get up and move away. He's not going to sit next to a woman. Why? Because the rules and the guidelines of his religion teach him that it's improper for him to have a casual touch or closeness with a woman who's not his wife. And so he, rather than to create a problem, he is simply going to stand up and walk away and move away so that he has no proximity. You know, he wouldn't have a problem touching men, but he would have a problem touching another woman and having a bodily contact. So you would see how, again, he's not being rude, he's not being mean, he's not saying that women are somehow worse than men or anything like that. It's just his religion teaches him that this is not right. And forget about him talking to a woman who's not his wife. That's not going to happen either. Because that's starting a conversation that can lead into a direction where he's not supposed to go. So there are rules by which people live, and those rules regulate how they communicate with everyone else around them. And a lot of times it is our religious belief and our religious commandments and tenets that guide us towards a particular behavior. And we should not judge that behavior by our standards. We should rather look at that behavior in light of what they're doing based on their culture, their religion. You know, they're not being rude or mean. They're actually being quite consistent. They're being good people and they're all understanding. So, but it's easy to misunderstand that. Now, let's see. There's a section here on notions about death in Islam, and that's it's a good section to know. Basically, we've already talked about the Jews and Muslims and Christians all believe in judgment, and so obviously Islam believes in judgment, and they also believe in resurrection, by the way. Okay, just like Jews and Christians do. Resurrected for the judgment, people die, they're resurrected for the judgment, and then they count for their good deeds and bad deeds. So God judges everyone. He judges it impartially. He looks at how people have lived and submitted to his will in Islam. So there's a little bit of a side over here that the authors talk about, the paradise and hell. And so this is a funny statement that I thought they made. This guy writes, let's see, on page 137, unlike most Western traditions, Islam provides graphic details of punishments in paradise that come after death. Paradise is a pleasant oasis where every man's desire, according to popular tradition, is satisfied either by his wife or by beautiful houris or virgins. Hell is a place of burning and heat with excruciating pains that are perpetual. So, yes, of course, that is the description of paradise and hell in Quran. And it actually goes a lot more. It's very, very graphic and very, very detailed. Let's put it that way. But I think it's wrong to say that other religions don't do the same, because if you read the Gospels, there are pretty good descriptions of heaven and hell there, and paradise and hell. And if you and in Christianity in general, for example, there is very graphic descriptions. Most Christians, I think, draw their understanding of heaven and hell more from popular culture and like the Dante's Inferno, for example, than from biblical books, because biblical books actually do not give descriptions of what heaven and hell look like a lot. There's very little that the Bible talks about as far as details of those things, but it doesn't mean that Christians don't embrace those ideas and details. They just do it through non-biblical books and through pop culture. And so things like that. I think Christians have just as crazy of ideas about heaven and hell as Muslims do. And they're very graphic. They're very scary. I mean, which one of you have not heard that the devil is all red and scary, and that he has a tail and he's supposed to, torture people in hell? I mean, I think every single person, who has anything to do with Christianity or has any exposure to a Western world thinks that the devil is like the general manager of hell who gets to torture you, right? And inflict pain upon you. And demons are like his, co-workers. He's the general manager and kind of runs the place. Everybody thinks that. Guess what? None of that's in the Bible at all. Completely. None of it. Zero. But people believe it and they embrace it and they think it's true. But, the fact that there is no general superintendent of hell according to the Bible. In fact, Satan or devil is the one who is being tortured. He himself is being enduring the punishment rather than dealing out the punishment. But that doesn't stop people from believing that he's in charge of hell, and that's kind of a merge between pagan beliefs of Greco-Roman culture about Hades and things like that, and the Christian conception of hell, where they kind of came to be. But anyway, so there's pretty crazy, fantastical ideas about heaven and hell in Islam. And as a result of that, people have sort of have drawn this idealistic picture of heaven and hell. And some people have even been driven to give their lives for the cause of Islam because they believe that guarantees them a place in heaven, in paradise. So, for example, the ideology of the suicide bombers and terrorists, within that particular Islamic thought, is that if they sacrifice their life for Allah, meaning if they lose their life, if they die for the glory of their religion, that they would basically be guaranteed paradise. Okay, and that is an alluring thought. And if paradise is all about pleasure, and you don't get a lot of pleasure in your life today, then that is certainly an incentive to maybe go out and do the kinds of things that people do, just to gain that better place in heaven, essentially, because their place on earth is not really a good one. So you could see how that could be a problem. So that's pretty much concludes the whole topic of Islam and where we are. Okay. Any questions, thoughts, ideas, any reflections you guys want to jump in? Do you see how believing these types of things might affect the way you communicate? Because how you embrace the world, how you understand the world now is going to reflect on how you live, and therefore how you speak to other people, how you relate to other people, what you say and what you don't say. Okay? You could see how that sort of a worldview will definitely guide you and make you very unique in your understanding of the world around you. Okay, so okay, good. No, I don't see any questions. I don't see anybody speaking up. All right, so let's keep moving on. Hinduism, let's hit that one. And then after Hinduism, we'll take a little break, all right? Hinduism is a much, much more ancient religion than Islam. We're talking about 4,000 years at least, okay? So we're definitely talking and way before Christianity, Hinduism is around. About 1 billion followers. Okay, that's massive. That is huge. That is a lot of Hindus, okay? So again, studying Hinduism is important. Why? Because you will most likely encounter people in the world who are Hindus, okay? And their perspective, their understanding of the world is important to know, because you will most likely communicate with people who embrace this ideology, okay? So what is Hinduism? The authors say that Hinduism is a religion with no single founder, no creed, no teacher or prophet. And that's true. They don't even have a single holy book. So like if Muslims have Quran and Christians have the Bible and Jews have the Bible, Hindus don't have anything like that. They have multiple books, and their books don't even agree with each other. Let's put it that way. So makes it very different. But they also don't have a founder. Okay? And their concept of the divine, their concept of God, is very different from the Western religions, or from the religions that I just described as far as the Islam and Christianity and Judaism go. Their understanding of who God is and what God is so different. So different. Is it a religion? Yeah, it's a religion. It's a unified system of beliefs. It's a unified system of behavior. But it is a very diverse system. Being as old as it is very, there are many, many types of Hindus, and there are many streams and divisions within Hinduism. And so you can understand how not having one book, one Bible, one way, they are really split up in several different directions. All right. So what are the origins of Hinduism? Now, Hinduism is a tough one to pin down, because again, it's not based on a life of a person or anything like that. The best that the scholars can say is that at some point, European people have migrated into that part of the world, and they blended with the local populations of that world, and they blended their myths and ideas together. And out of that came a very unique philosophy of life, a very unique belief in a multiplicity of gods and deities, And those customs, traditions, philosophies, and the ways of life, they were blended between some European notions and some definitely Eastern notions, blended into this unique system that we call Hinduism. Okay. As I said, it is probably the most diverse religion out there because they don't have one way of doing things, or one path to life. There's no one single list of commandments that one must do. There's not one single teaching about anything in Hinduism, and so that makes it very different in a sense. It gives people a lot of room to work around it. So there are several sacred texts that the authors present in this book on page 139. They talk about the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita particularly, and so there are other Gitas as well. But those are the main ones. The texts, because Hinduism is such an ancient religion, most ancient religions were oral. They were not written. These things have existed just by people passing them on, and then at some point later, much later, somebody decided to write it down. So these books that Hindus have are actually, the content is much older than when they were written down. So like the Vedas were written down like 1400 BC, right? But the content is much older. It's been passed around orally for so long. And so then, what's in them, of course, the content is all, it says the Vedas are hymns, ritual texts, speculations, of all sorts on life. The Upanishads is 800 to 400 BCE. Again, you could see how ancient these texts are. But the actual teachings of the Upanishads are even older than that, okay? So Upanishads is all about reality and the sense of oneness and how everything is connected in the universe. And it talks about your soul, and it talks about meditation and things like that. So that's another text that, within Hinduism that gives you a certain revelation, sort of say, that has been collected for a long time by people and now passed on, about the nature of the universe and self and one and soul and things like that. Bhagavad Gita is a very interesting book. Another, 540 to 300 BCE, and basically it's a dialogue between a deity, Krishna, and one particular prince, okay, Prince Aruna. And so as a dialogue, it kind of presents this long conversation, okay, and it's philosophical, and it asks the big questions in life and things like that. But in the end, as a religious text, it just teaches the core tenets of Hindu belief, that God has existed, and that God is exalted, that God is sublime, He's within us. God is us, God is within us, and so He is above all limitations, and essentially, if we understand that, we can be liberated. It's a little bit difficult to understand before we get into the core assumptions of Hinduism. But basically, Hinduism sees the idea of divine reality or God in a very different way. And if you don't understand that, if you keep thinking that, it's not different from Christianity and Judaism, you will fail to understand the reason why Hinduism is the way it is. Basically, Hindus believe that divine is in everything. This is so different from Christian or Jewish or Islamic notions of God. Everything is God. God is in all things. God is in this microphone that I'm using here right now. He's in me, He's in you, He's in this computer screen, He's in all things. And therefore, everything is divine. But that's a very different way of looking at the world, at the reality. God is in the trees, God is in the animals. He's in all things. And and that makes God not as defined and certainly not personal. Okay, so while in Christianity God is personal, in Judaism God is personal, in Islam God is personal. He has a personality, he has a character traits, he has attributes. Those things don't exist in Judaism. I mean, in Hinduism, I'm sorry. In Hinduism, God is just in all things. He takes many forms. He has no gender, he has no number, he has no one single manifestations. And therefore, it makes sense that Hindus represent God through animals and plants and crazy looking creatures, with multiple arms and heads of elephants and bodies of humans. And I mean, it makes sense that they kind of blend it all together, because to them, God is not one thing. He's many things, whatever God is. And to them, God is the ultimate reality. There's no personality to God. There's no limitation to God. And that makes it so different. So the Western version of reality has to do with material world, okay? Things we can touch and feel and see. The Eastern notion of reality moves far beyond the material world to the world that you cannot see, you cannot touch, or even cannot know, because you cannot see it and touch it as a human being. But there's these ideas of other layers of realities and alternate realities, and that is where God is. Not in our world and not just in that world, but he's both realities at the same time. So essentially, Hindus believe that God is the ultimate reality. They talk about Brahman. You might have heard that word, Brahman. Brahman is creation and the creator. He is all things that are physical and non-physical. He is all things that are mental and emotional. That's Brahman. That's reality. That's divine in Hinduism. He's all-inclusive, absolutely transcendent, supports everything, yet he is everything at the same time. And so it's really hard to understand. Brahman is like one world, which is one soul, but within himself, he contains all things. Time, space, being, all things. Okay? That is a tough one for a person who embraces, a Jewish, Christian, or Islamic view to embrace, to understand. That is a tough one, because that is a picture of God or divinity or reality that is absolutely nothing like what people in other religions understand. So hopefully you're starting to understand why Hinduism does not have one single book or one single set of rules or one single set of commandments or even one single way of behaving, because Brahman is all things. Everything is Brahman, and there's many paths to interact with the divine. So there is a concept within Hinduism that is really important to understand, and that is the concept of nirvana. Nirvana is kind of like an enlightenment, but more along the lines of an escape. If you want to relate that to salvation in Christianity, that's kind of similar to that. Hinduism believes in reincarnation, and reincarnation is endless. It's an endless cycle of being born and dying and born and dying and born and dying. And the only way you can escape cycle is to achieve nirvana. And how you get to nirvana is actually quite complicated, which goes into the multiple paths, that Hindus practice to achieve nirvana. But basically, nirvana is the escape of the endless cycles of reincarnations and rebirths. Your soul is eternal. A soul is timeless. Your body is temporary. So your soul never dies. You just keep being reborn and reborn and reborn into a new body. That is a very different concept, once again, for people who come from a Jewish, Christian, or Islamic understanding of life. Life is circular. There is no you die and then there's judgment. That doesn't exist. You see, it's an endless cycle of rebirths, and the only way you escape it is through nirvana. So the notions of that are hard to comprehend. Okay, so let's pause for a second. Let's see if you guys, if you have any questions, and maybe something I'm not explaining clearly. I mean, I know the textbook gives you a pretty good explanation, but sometimes you need to, break things down even more basic. Let's put it that way to get it. So does it make sense? Is there something that I can explain to you maybe a little bit further, a little bit more on Hinduism to kind of help you understand the different conceptual framework that this particular religious or philosophical worldview operates in? Anybody? Are you guys familiar with Hinduism to whatever degree you're familiar with it, which is good, but never stop learning and trying to understand but be cautious of comparing your worldview with their worldview. You almost have to take their worldview for what it is and put yours aside, okay? And because if you judge everything through your own eyes, it's very difficult. I'm always comparing it because we cannot move away from our worldview which we possess. I'm saying this is very different from somebody, but for a Hindu, your worldview is just as weird as their worldview. To you, they think, oh, it's crazy to think that life is over and this is it, and then you go stand in judgment. They're like, you're insane. Life is never over. The soul is eternal. Like they'll tell you these things, and they will think you're insane for thinking the way you're thinking, because to them this is natural. And so whatever philosophy or worldview the person embraces becomes normal to them, and that's how they see everything in the world. And the competing views are the strange ones. Let's put it that way. Okay, so I find Hinduism to be a very interesting perspective on life. Certainly not something that I grew up with or something that I share, but I understand it. And as I understand it, it helps me understand people who practice Hindu faith and practice Hindu lifestyle. It makes complete sense once I understand what is it that they're trying to accomplish, or what is it that they believe, and why do they live their lives the way they do. So there are multiple paths in Hinduism. Hinduism does not believe that there's just like one way and that's it. You can basically achieve understanding of nirvana through multiple paths. Not one way of gaining salvation, let's put it that way. Where in other religions, there's just one thing that you need to do, and this is the only path, and this is it. Narrow is the road, kind of an idea. In Hinduism, all roads eventually lead to nirvana. Okay? It's just how long it's going to take you, and whether you're going to get there or not, and how and when, and so things like that. A person can follow the path of magic, or worship nature, or venerate animals, or many deities, go worship at the temple, do this, bring sacrifices. All of those things eventually will lead the person in the right way. And nobody's going to say, oh, no, you're doing this wrong. There is no wrong way. All paths are right, and they lead you eventually in that direction that you're supposed to go for. So there are several paths in Hinduism on page 141 that the authors highlight. The path of work, okay, karma yoga, is the selfless action where you basically do things and you get to you get to your redemption, you get to your nirvana through the samsara and reincarnation by just working it, by working through life. The other one is the path of knowledge, okay? So where you engage in philosophy and wisdom, and it's that philosophy and wisdom that eventually will lead you into nirvana. Or there's the path of physical and mental discipline, okay? Where you practice meditation and exercise that will eventually lead you in the right direction. Or there's the path of love, which is where you serve others and show devotion to others, and that will lead you towards nirvana. So there's these several channels, several paths that people can follow. And presumably, if you are a Hindu, you believe that because of reincarnation, you probably are combining multiplicity of those paths throughout various life cycles that you live. And eventually you do get to nirvana by practicing those different paths in different different lives as you go through the endless cycle of rebirths. All right. So these are pretty, complicated things to embrace, but let's put it this way. Let's look a little bit more on cultural kind of ideals of Hinduism here. The complete way of life, again, for Hindus, just like for Muslims and for others, you do what you do because of who you are. Religion is the center of all things. And the center of all things is religion. There's no such thing for Hindu as a non-religious life. They're spiritual by virtue of being alive. I mean, and that is again, a non-Western notion, but that is how they see it. All Easterners will see life that way. It's fully integrated rather than segmented. There's a tendency in the Western thinking to segment things, and there's a tendency in the Eastern thinking to unify things. And once you understand that, you will see that in religion, philosophy, everything, in every area of life, people will unify versus segment, or segment versus unify. So people might go to temples in Hindu religions. They may do certain ritual actions, bring sacrifices, burn incense, all sorts of things. But it's the practices of home life that are most important. Religion for a Hindu does not happen in some place, some sacred place. It's not about pilgrimage. It's not about the temple. Religion is an everyday life. That's what religion really is. And it's life at home. So most rituals occur at home during your daily life. Whatever pilgrimage a person might choose to do at the temple is more of an add-on rather than the focus. Okay? So, which brings us to the concepts that are related, of concept of Dharma and Karma. Okay, both are really important to understand. Dharma really means something like righteousness or law or duty, morality. It's what you do. Okay, and in Hinduism, Dharma is also a god, which embodies the right way of life. Let's put it that way. So that's what Dharma is. Dharma is just a right way of life, if you want to think about it. And if you go against Dharma, then what's going to happen is you're going to have negative effects in your life. It's like this is the natural flow of things, and you're trying to swim against the stream, basically. You're going against the flow. And so Dharma is the right flow, and you stay within that flow and kind of coast along. And it's all about that proper direction. But karma is something else. Karma is the law of consequence, the law of causality. If you do this, this will happen. If you do that, that will happen. So there's good karma and there's bad karma. And how do you cause good karma, cause bad karma, is by engaging in actions that are good or bad, or rather actions that are proper or improper, or rather actions that are consistent with the direction in which you're supposed to be moving, or inconsistent with the direction that you're supposed to be moving. Because remember, it's the Dharma that gives you the direction, but it's the karma that determines whether what is the effect, the cause and effect of you fighting it or not fighting it, obeying it or disobeying it, going along or resisting it. And so karma is the law of consequence. Okay, karma is the reason why people do not stop being reborn, bad karma in particularly. So if you live the good life and you store up enough good karma, you stop the cycle of rebirth and you achieve nirvana. But if you do not have enough good karma, or you have too much bad karma, meaning there's too many consequences in life that are negative, you will keep being reborn. In fact, you will be reborn into lower life forms. You know, in this life, maybe you're a human being. And this life, maybe you were born in a good, nice, decent, maybe wealthy family. and you have pretty good health and things work out. But if you do not live your life right, the next life you might be born into a cat. Okay, and maybe you will not be a cat in a nice person's house. Maybe you will be a cat living in some alley looking for scraps from some restaurant back door or something like that. And maybe you'll get run over by a car. And if you build up some good karma as a cat, maybe you'll come back again as a human being or an elephant or something else. You never know. The idea of the rebirths, you can go into lower life forms and higher life forms, better situations, worse situations. All of that is dependent on karma, and karma is dependent on where you are. The karma of a plant is very different from a karma of a cat, and very different from a karma of a human. Why? Because our responsibilities as those life forms are completely different. Okay, so it's the balance of good karma and bad karma that makes you reincarnate in different forms, and eventually, if you keep moving towards the right direction, you escape the cycle of reincarnation by achieving nirvana. You got to the end stop, and then you become one with Brahman. Brahman is the ultimate reality. You fuse with the world soul, and that's it. You escaped this life essentially. So hopefully that makes you understand the Dharma and the Karma and how they work together. I know it's sometimes takes a little bit of a stretch because it may be a foreign concept for you, but it is completely cohesive, and it makes total sense once you start kind of understanding how they work in the mind of a Hindu person. Okay. The book talks about 4 stages of life. It has more to do with duties and things like that. Remember, Hinduism is all about living. So the authors note that not everyone achieves those stages, because those stages have to do with liberation. They have to do with samsara. They have to do with reincarnation and storing up good karma. So the first stage of life is the student stage, where basically you become a student of the teachings of Hinduism, and maybe you study under a teacher and they teach you good life and good principles. Then you move on to, and that's usually reserved for like young boys or something like that. Then you become a householder, meaning you get married, you have a family, you have a wife, you have children, you work, you raise children. And of course, you fulfill your obligations to your family and you do the right things. And so hopefully you store up good karma that way and things work right. Then the next stage is called the forest dweller. Okay, that's where you have already met your obligations. You had your family, you had your kids, you raised them, you helped them, you did what you needed to do as far as your social obligations. And now you can focus on yourself. Okay, that means you go and you study more and you devote yourself to intensive meditation and deeper study, so that your soul can be elevated. Again, now you focus on yourself. You focused on everybody else. Now you come back to yourself. And then the 4th stage is an ascetic. That's where basically a person renounces the world. He becomes independent of his possessions, and he basically goes out and lives out there in the middle of nowhere, completely separated from society. And in short, he is liberated from ordinary life. He doesn't have to worry about bathing or brushing his teeth or food or anything else. Why? Because it's not really a part of life anymore. He's gone. He's an ascetic. He's separated himself. And that is the final stage, and very few people actually go into that stage of life. But essentially, those are 4 stages of life as Hinduism idealizes them. Okay. But they're consecutive. You don't just, jump into 4th stage when you are in the 1st stage yourself. So these ideals of Hinduism, they kind of show the spiritual journey that the person goes through. The teachings of Hinduism, the books that we talked about, the Upanishads, the Vedas, all of them essentially teach you self-control, generosity, compassion, restraint, good things. There's lots of moral teachings within Hinduism. But as far as notions about death, we've already talked about it. Hinduism is unique because it believes in unlimited number of deaths and rebirths. Death is not feared because it's just the next step to the next life. People are not afraid to die at all because they know, as far as they're concerned, they're just going to come right back. Okay. And that's, so it creates a very different culture when it comes to death among the Hindus, because to them, death is not final. It's not something scary at all. You don't have a beginning, you don't have an end. You just continue on. Let's see. The soul is what separates from the body, essentially, in Hinduism, and the soul moves on, but the body is destroyed. And so Hindu burials are usually done through cremation. And after they cremate, they put the ashes of the body into the river. So you come back. And that, again, just shows their worldview of God being in all things and God is being everything. So you're kind of returning back into the environment. You're going to think about it this way. So a very, unique, holistic way of life in Hinduism. So hopefully it makes sense to you guys. Any questions, any thoughts, you wanted to bring up? Maybe I can help you out with any aspects of Hinduism. Maybe something the book says is not clear. Just jump in. Anyone? Is this weird? Is this different? Are you having struggling with this? It's hard. It's hard to put your own understanding of life and how the world works away and to embrace this. But that's what I'm asking you to do, and that's what the authors are asking you to do first. Just for a moment, pretend that you actually believe these things, and then they'll start to make sense to you. And that is probably the most helpful way to understand other people, is to enter their world and to kind of at least mentally adopt their ideas so that you can understand them. Okay, nobody's speaking up, so I assume we're okay. That's all right. I don't mind. I kind of felt that you guys might be quiet on this topic because there's so much information here. But let's take a break. It's 10:38. Let's take 10 minutes. Then we come back. Okay, so take a break, stretch out, walk around, get a coffee, go to the bathroom, whatever you got to do. Don't leave the meeting. Just kind of mute yourself and, and just kind of stay muted. You can turn off your cameras and stuff, and I'll do the same. And then we'll come back in 10 minutes. All right.